A very warm welcome to all of you. I have great pleasure in sharing this place in the MDC, courtesy the NSR cell, to introduce to you the Honorable Chris Alexander, the Minister for Citizenship and Immigration of Canada. He is with us today. Just to give a little background of where he is from, apart from being from Canada. He actually is a diplomat, so I do have some fraternal feelings towards him, because I too was a diplomat at one time. And having started his career in Russia, way back, I'm sure, last century, and recently he has been wearing two hats. First as the Ambassador of Canada in Kabul, and then supervising and taking care of the UN aid mission in the whole of Afghanistan at a very crucial time, lasting till about 2009 or so, nearly 5 years. And he must have had experiences of seeing a country, being rebuilt at very close quarters at that phase of his career. And at the end of his career, he returned back, of course, and now he is a member of parliament from the Ajax Pickering constituency near Ontario in Canada. The fact that we have him here all to ourselves for a little more than an hour speaks volumes of the attention that he gives to India, and is also a reflection of the close relations that exist between our two countries. He would be talking to us about the state of economic relations between India and Canada. Permit me, Your Excellency, to also share with the audience. We have to the left of His Excellency the Consul General of Canada based in Bangalore, Mr. Frank. And to my immediate left is Mr. Nadir Patel, the High Commissioner Designate of Canada to India. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Minister and his colleagues.
Thank you so much for the very warm welcome and for your introduction. Wonderful to be introduced by a fellow professional foreign service officer, and wonderful to be on your extremely beautiful grounds and in this gem of architecture that you all have the good fortune of calling home for a certain number of months, I guess would be the minimum, and for up to 2 years in many of your cases. The reputation of this place, even though I am in Bangalore for the first time, precedes it in every way. We in Canada have based a lot of our economic growth and success on the success of business education, on the discipline that has been brought to our private sector leaders by the MBA. As delivered in Canada, but by other schools to which Canadians have the good fortune to be exposed. But IIMB has a special place, obviously, in India's pantheon of business schools and in the global one. So let me begin simply by paying tribute to all of you for the excellence you have displayed in having the privilege of walking through these doors, and to this institution for its excellence on the global educational scene, and as a production center for fantastic entrepreneurs and business leaders today and over decades now. I arrive here under some very powerful impressions from now a couple of days in India. And I'm here with my colleague, the Member of Parliament for Calgary Northeast, representing one of our most vibrant cities, Devinder Shori, whose the early part of whose life was also in this country, and so who is living example of the success of Canadian immigration and the success of our bilateral relations. But we have just been in Gujarat, together with our incoming High Commissioner, seeing for the first time in my case the success of that state in attracting investment, in becoming an even greater business hub, thanks to strong leadership, thanks to a principled program of reforms that have made it a very powerful platform for business partnership around the world. And it was my first opportunity to meet the former Chief Minister who launched Vibrant Gujarat, now your Prime Minister, who is making a very powerful impression, obviously across India and around the world, because he not only has the determination and the program to display and to pursue in partnership with so many stakeholders across this country, from Digital India to smart cities to Make in India to Clean India, all very compelling aspects of a wide-ranging agenda. But he also has the track record to show of success in not a small state, but a large state. And it's not a small success, it's a major success, I think, by anyone's standards. And if one's looking at the transformation of states, provinces, subjects of federations in a global context of emerging economies, Gujarat, over the period that Narendra Modi was in charge, is going to be one of those cases very urgently studied. And so we come to you absolutely convinced that India is on the verge of a very different chapter, a very exciting chapter of growth, of unlocking of potential, because, as we were saying in an earlier discussion, stars are aligning domestically, and expectations are set internationally to bring partnership to a new level. And so I'd like to take these few minutes simply to give the Canadian perspective on partnership with India, to tell you a little bit about what is happening in Canada, to make our economic story, growth story, a compelling one. We think it's both a story of success as an advanced economy, as a high-income economy, in spite of the downdrafts and the really catastrophic effects in some parts of the world of the financial crisis, which affected the high-income economies more than emerging economies for the first time in our lifetimes. But we think we're also an emerging economy, in that one sees it perhaps more clearly as immigration minister than in some of the other portfolios. Canada is still growing in absolute terms. Canada is still reaching the steady state path trajectory of growth in our population that is justified by our resource base and by the size of our territory. We are, in territory, even bigger than India. Quite a bit bigger than India. All right, quite a bit colder as well, and much less arable land, but we are only 35 million people to your 1.2 million. And if we do talk about India as a major component of our immigration, of our visitor flows, of our student flows, we're still only talking about 1.2 million Canadians who trace their roots to this country, and that is 1/1000th of your population. And so there is a lot of scope to right-size the relationship, but to include an increase in Canada's population through immigration and domestic growth to realize the full potential of our resource base and our territorial base, which we are still determined, which we as a government are determined to seize. Now, it wasn't always so in Canada, in Canada's case. We weren't always seen, even in my longer lifetime than yours, as, in fact, almost never seen as a particularly safe haven, as a anchor of stability, or a relatively robust financial system as against the experience of our peer countries, larger peers, the United States, the United Kingdom, other European countries, and Asian peers. In fact, when I was growing up in the 1970s, early 1980s, the biggest concerns in Canada were high inflation, relatively high debt levels, persistent deficits at the federal level, high unemployment levels, often over 10% through those years. And it wasn't until we started to get the size of government right in the 1980s and 1990s, bring our spending under control and bring fiscal discipline back. It had been a hallmark of Canada over the longer term, over 200 years, but the discipline was lost in the 60s and 70s. And that process was completed to some extent in the 1990s by a different political party than ours, which made rather dramatic cuts especially to transfers from the federal government to the provinces, which had some negative consequences in that the provinces were starved of resources to deliver healthcare and education, which are provincial responsibilities in Canada. But by the time we came to the end of the 20th century, the early 21st century, we were still seen as a lower income country, certainly than the United States, struggling to keep pace with the most affluent European economies, not a particularly deep set of capital markets as against our Asian, European, other North American peers. We were, let's call it, a second-class G7 country with an uncertain strategic future, certainly a strong producer of resources, certainly a talented workforce, but not necessarily the place to go as an entrepreneur or the place to be with a startup idea or the go-to jurisdiction for someone trying to locate a global enterprise with reach into all of the major markets. So what's happened in the past 10 years to change that? I mean, certainly we have all been tested by 2008, 2009, and Canada was not immune to that crisis, which began beyond our borders. But our banks didn't fail. They didn't have to be bailed out. We didn't have a real estate market that collapsed overnight, as the one to the south of us did. Property values held up. Unemployment did not spike in the way it has and remains stubbornly high in Europe, or even to the extent it did in the United States. And we have, a longer history of institutional good planning to thank for that robustness in our financial system. The supervisors truly were separate from the banks themselves. It wasn't the foxes watching over the hen house. The capital requirements for banks were much more demanding than they had become in London or New York. And in fact, you can say that Basel III is an attempt to bring the global financial system closer to the Canadian model, closer to the ratios that we were requiring of banks before the financial crisis, as much as anything else. And certainly Mark Carney, our governor of the Bank of Canada during the crisis, who is now the governor of the Bank of England, but who's been running the Financial Stability Board in the interim, has been instrumental in setting these new standards, but strongly informed by Canadian experience. So we had a certain robustness through the crisis, but what else has happened to make us a more competitive jurisdiction, a more attractive economy in comparative terms, really than we've ever been in our contemporary history? I think you have to go back a long way to find a time when Canada was as attractive as it is today. And don't ask any of us, to tell you where it ranks or why it ranks highly. This is Forbes and Bloomberg, KPMG saying that Canada is now the best or one of the best business environments in the world, according to all of the factors that go into their ratings. Well, the story really is one of a government in partnership with the private sector that has made tough choices over the past 10 years. And we're coming up on an election later this year. Our Prime Minister has been in office since 2006, but absolutely determined really to do three things on the economic front. First, whatever the cost, to return to balance, to return to surplus, to make sure that fiscal consolidation continued to happen at a time when, in our view, in global terms, the full potential of entrepreneurship and business will only be unleashed if government reduces the share of the economy that it had been occupying in the middle of the 20th century for reasons that those times justified. I mean, the social programs that we began in the immediate post-war era and scaled up in the 1960s were necessary, but they don't need to be as big in relative terms now as they were then, and they can be delivered much more efficiently by government when we innovate in government, when we insist on bringing entrepreneurship to government. And so we paid back a huge amount of debt in 2006, 2007, before the crisis. We went back into deficit in 8, 9, 10, and a couple of years afterwards to undertake a stimulus program. But throughout those years, in addition to repaying debt, we launched the most ambitious program in the OECD, perhaps in the whole world, of reducing taxes at every level, starting with a 7 to 5% reduction in the goods and services tax, our value-added tax, continuing with very targeted tax relief for families to try and literally give a leg up to those aspirational, hardworking individuals, the middle class, that are the lifeblood of all of our economies. And then to try and put our corporate taxes on a footing that would make them the most competitive in the world. And yes, there are places like Dubai and Estonia that have lower corporate tax rates, but you won't find, I think, an OECD country, certainly not a G7 country, with a lower corporate tax rate than Canada. And that has never been the case in our history, certainly not vis-a-vis the United States, and for most of our history, not vis-a-vis the UK. So fiscal discipline, lower taxes, more efficient government. We're trying to put all of the back end of government, IT, and other shared services under one roof, and to make sure that 30 plus departments share one efficient back office rather than each having their own. And yes, let the companies of Bangalore bid on some of that work as well. They do, and do succeed. But what else have we done? We've tried to put a focus of government investment in economic excellence in our economies that are truly strategic. And one of those areas has been innovation, investment in the high-end emerging areas of research and development that we know are not just important in and of themselves, but have the potential to lead to the emergence of entirely new sectors of the economy, entirely new fields of industrial growth. And so we have a Perimeter Institute in Waterloo, Canada. We have a quantum institute funded partly by the government, mostly by a private sector benefactor, trying to ensure that even as Silicon Valley succeeds, a quantum valley emerges in Canada ahead of what might emerge elsewhere that will take computing and all of the technologies connected to it into a new era of much more efficient and much faster outputs than ever before. We are investing, obviously, in the success of our resource industries. We are criticized by our own people sometimes for being too dependent on oil, gas, potash, base metals, gold, all of which we produce in abundance. But what people forget is that these resources are really everywhere in the world. They could be developed on a much larger scale in Africa, certainly in Russia, in other parts of Asia, Latin America. Why has Canada been successful? Because of the relentless application of cutting-edge technology, because of management discipline, because of financial markets that are innovative enough to raise money to ensure that, in the mining industry, for example, the majority of startups, exploration and prospecting ventures, are actually financed out of Toronto, out of the Toronto Stock Exchange in any given year. There's lots that come out of London and Australia as well, but Toronto still has this dominant position because of a combination of those policy strategies and those professional competences that are concentrated there. So it's not about the rocks and the oil. It's about the technology and the people. And we are determined to stay at the forefront, obviously, in that sector, just as we're determined to continue investing in clean energy, all of the technologies that are going to make us more efficient at extracting, refining, using, recovering, recycling the materials that are connected to a natural resources industry. So strategic investments have been one focus. Another focus has clearly been on complementing a relatively open business market, business environment, a relatively low tax business environment with openness to new markets. And so even as the global economy was literally collapsing in 2008, 2009, we were continuing to advocate the opening of markets. And a country that had, I think, 5 or 6 free trade agreements with the United States and Mexico, and then really only a couple of small countries beyond that, now has free trade agreements with well over 40 countries, including the entire European Union. We're the first major non-European partner to have inked a comprehensive economic and trade agreement with Europe. It's not in force yet, but well on the path to ratification. We have our first major free trade agreement with Asia, in this case with the Republic of Korea. We have a foreign investment protection agreement with China. We've broadened our free trade arrangements in Latin America with Chile, Peru, several countries in Central America, the Pacific Alliance, and obviously the centerpiece of our agenda with India is completion of a FIPA and final negotiation of a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, which we think would be absolutely transformational for both of our countries. And so we have been sometimes a lone voice in the wilderness, but always over the past 8 or 9 years, a constant advocate for trade liberalization and opponent, literally, of protectionism, because we know the prosperity that goes with it. Before we had free trade with the United States, our bilateral trade with that country, this is before 1988, was well under $200 billion a year. I think it was more like $150 billion a year. This year it will be over $700 billion. It's the largest trading relationship between any two countries in the world, $2 billion a day. And without that, literally you can lop 15 or 20% off of the standard of living of the average standard of living, of the average income of Canadians. And so we see the opportunity of free trade between North America and the major Asian economies, between North America and Europe, literally underpinning the next phase of growth and prosperity in all of our countries, and we're determined to be at the forefront of that agenda. We have also, though, understood, I think faster than most other OECD countries, most other countries that depend on immigration for their growth to some extent, that immigration is one of the key political and economic factors of growth in our era that too often goes neglected. There are two liabilities with immigration that can happen. You can either not have it and not benefit from the talent of the 7 billion people on this planet, many of whom have unique experiences, unique niche skills, without which international capital investors are not going to want to locate a project, locate a research initiative in either of our countries, because that person is too critical to building the team. So you can have too little immigration, and that can be disastrous. On the other hand, you can have uncontrolled, unplanned, irregular migration, which can lead to a collapse of political consensus, a polarization of the political spectrum. We've seen that in Europe in recent years as asylum seekers and simply migrants, economic migrants across Europe have come in large numbers at times when there are very high unemployment in most European jurisdictions, causing a backlash, causing a loss of support, causing frequent changes of government, and causing a loss of economic direction in the process. So when that political consensus is lost, an immigration program that has started can stop quickly and then be restarted, leading to a failure to unlock the strategic value of immigration, which really has to be pursued over years and indeed decades. So we've made it one of our priorities as a government to carefully but very deliberately reform our immigration programs while maintaining a political consensus that this was the right thing to do. Where were we in 2006? We had backlogs. Anyone applying to immigrate to Canada from Bangalore in 2008 or 2009 as a federal skilled worker with your kinds of skills would have been told, delighted to have your application, but we'll get back to you in 7 or 8 years with an answer. And for you, for any reasonably ambitious person, that was not a particularly encouraging answer. We've worked our way through most of those backlogs. Today, as of January 1st this year, we have a program called a system for delivering our economic immigration programs called Express Entry. Check it out online. Canada.ca/immigration, it's all there. It's a recruitment-based system. You can establish a profile, and you have to establish an online profile to be eligible in about 15 minutes, as long as you have your language assessment and your educational assessment in hand. And then your profile will be ranked and sorted against the profiles of everyone else around the world interested in coming. If you meet the minimum requirements of one of our programs, which account for most of our immigration, you will be told immediately that you are in the pool, that you've qualified, that you've met the requirements, and then almost certainly within a couple of weeks you'll be invited to apply to come to Canada. You'll have to fill out the entire application at that point, but with a very high degree of certainty that you will be accepted, and we will process that application in 6 months or less. So we are trying to say to the best people around the world, to those who see an opportunity for themselves in Canada, or where employers in Canada see an opportunity to bring someone who's not otherwise available, that we're going to move at the speed of business, not at the speed of bureaucracy. and we're complementing that with much larger visitor flows. My team at our new Consulate General in Bangalore, and I should be introducing Sidney Frank, our new Consul General. I think you heard from him earlier. Sarah, his immigration program manager. We're processing visa applications, visitor visa applications, study permit applications in Bangalore for all of southern India these past few months for the first time in our history. We are complementing that express entry with historically high levels of issuance of visitor visas. We're giving almost everyone 10-year multiple entry visas now, and we're saying we want to see a lot of you, whether as a tourist or to visit your families or go to a wedding or make some business contacts. It doesn't matter, and we're complementing that with a very aggressive strategy to sell Canadian education market, Canadian education in India and elsewhere. And we saw a 50% jump in the number of Indian students in 2014 over 2013. So immigration for us is, yes, about forming a larger workforce, accessing global talent, but it's also about connectivity with those huge emerging markets. India and China are particularly present in our immigration these days, with which we want to have enduring bonds, and where we want to underpin those bonds with recent immigrants who are going to work in either one or the other country or both. And that's why India was, again, our #1 source country for immigration in 2014. And we're very proud of the interplay between the education partnerships we have and the immigration streams that we have, flows that we have. And I think we're the only country, possibly with Australia, in the last 2 years that's lifting its immigration levels. Ours are going from 260,000 last year to 280,000 this year. So for anyone in the room who's interested in spending a part or all of your careers in Canada, the door is wide open. Final point. We're delighted by the partnerships that you have as an institute in Canada. We know about I still call it the University of Western Ontario, but it's now Western University, Ivy School of Business, which has a very proud relationship with you. There's also the Schulich School at York, I know, which is partnered with you here in Bangalore, as well as my home University of McGill and the University of British Columbia. We are very, very much convinced that the complementarity of India's and Canada's economies must speak to us all about a potential for growth that is going to be on a much faster track in the future. Whether one looks at infrastructure or food security and agri-food, whether one looks at India's energy deficit and our determination to export beyond North America, innovation and technology, where we are major importers of your expertise to ensure that the back offices of Canadian banks and other corporate players are as efficient as possible. We are on a path to seeing higher levels of investment, higher levels of trade in the years to come, and our High Commissioner is going to make sure all that happens. But we cannot do it without leadership. We cannot do it without exchange. We cannot do it without continuing innovation to bring ourselves together in new ways. And that's why our immigration program not only has high levels and faster service, but a startup visa for entrepreneurs, which allows someone with a startup idea who finds a Canadian angel or venture capital fund in Canada willing to invest in them, or simply does a deal without any financing with a Canadian incubator to come to Canada as an immigrant, and they will get 6 months service as well. We've had the first people come last year. We know that there are some candidates for this program from Bangalore and from India that are in the pipeline. It's the first program of its kind, and we look forward to benefiting from that kind of linkage between the startup ecosystems of India and the startup ecosystems of Canada, moving people in both directions to optimize workforces, to optimize capital allocation to the benefit of all of us. We also have an immigrant investor program for those with proven business track records. They put down $2 million, prove that they have $10 million in net worth. That money goes into a venture capital fund in Canada to fund more startups, and we award permanent residence upfront to the investor together with their spouse and dependent children under 18. So for us, fiscal rectitude go hand in hand with investments in productivity, the industries of the future, open markets, and very concerted efforts to overcome the skills mismatch that is happening the world over, where too many people, not in this room, but in other classrooms across India and across Canada, are graduating not necessarily with the skills that businesses need, graduating with the skills businesses needed 10 years ago, or maybe 18 months ago, and not with the skills that they need today. We need both immigration policies and skills education and training policies in all of our countries to make sure that young people coming onto the job market now make that connection with employers, fill the jobs that are available today to their benefit, to the benefit of our economies, and to the benefit of our peoples. Thank you very much.